On October 1st, 2021, an oil sheen began to spread across the waters of San Pedro Bay, California. A 17-mile-long underwater pipeline was leaking crude oil. But when investigators later examined the damaged section of pipe, they made an astonishing discovery. The damage that caused the leak, the anchor scars and the deep gouges, had not happened that day. It had happened 9 months earlier. How can a pipeline become mortally wounded and not bleed for 9 months? This is the story of a silent disaster and the cascade of human errors that finally gave it a voice. Our story begins not with an accident, but with a global crisis. In late 2020 and into 2021, the pandemic had exposed and created insanity. Off the coast of Southern California, an unprecedented fleet of the world's largest container ships sat at anchor for weeks, waiting for a berth. The designated anchorage areas were filled to capacity, and running right alongside these crowded anchorages was the San Pedro Bay Pipeline, a 16-inch steel artery lying exposed on the ocean floor, an unseen hazard in a sea of giants. On January 24th, 2021, the National Weather Service issued a gale warning. A strong cold front was moving in. By the early morning of January 25th, winds were gusting to 47 knots. The seas were building, and on the screens of the Vessel Traffic Service, or VTS, the alarms began to scream. Multiple, overlapping anchor-dragging alarms from a dozen massive ships. The VTS watchstanders were overwhelmed, trying to contact vessel after vessel in the chaos. 2 of those vessels were the container ships Beijing and MSC Danit. At 0350, the anchor alarm sounded on the Beijing's bridge. They were dragging. The master ordered the engines started and the anchor heaved. But as the crew on the bow fought the winds, the anchor windlass motor overloaded and stopped. They were now adrift, dragging 1,000 feet of chain and a 16-ton anchor across the sea floor, directly toward the pipeline. At the same time, the MSC Danit also began to drag east, pushed by the fierce winds. Her crew fought to hold position, but the ship was already crossing over the pipeline's charted location. In the chaos of that morning, something critical happened while in complete silence. The anchor of the Beijing struck the pipeline multiple times, scraping away its concrete coating and deforming the steel. The anchor of the MSC Danit then struck the pipeline in the same area, dragging it and displacing a 4,000-foot section over 100 feet from its original position. But there was no explosion. There was no immediate leak. The crews, unaware of the specific impact, eventually regained control of their vessels. The storm passed, the ships eventually went to port, and the San Pedro Bay Pipeline continued to operate, but it was now carrying a hidden, fatal wound. The anchor strikes had created a deep dent and gouge in the pipeline. This is where the clock began to tick. The damage introduced a weak point in the steel, similar to bending a paperclip back and forth every time the pressure inside the pipeline changed. The steel at the bottom of that dent was stressed. Slowly, invisibly, a microscopic fatigue crack began to form. Over the next 9 months, with every passing day, that crack grew, inch by inch, through the half-inch thick steel wall. 9 months later, on October 1st at 1610 local time, the inevitable happened. The crack broke through the pipe wall. On the control panel at Platform Ellie, the leak detection system sounded its first alarm. But the controllers were already primed to disbelieve it. Earlier that day, an operational issue had sent 100 times the normal amount of water into the pipeline. The controllers assumed this water was causing a false alarm. They shut down the pump, waited a few minutes, and restarted it. At 15:52, the second alarm sounded. They shut down the pump again. The night shift controller took over. He visually checked the pipeline on the platform and saw nothing. At 19:15, the third alarm. At 20:39, the fourth. Each time the controllers, convinced the alarms were false, restarted the system. They were battling what they thought was a faulty system. Their computers told them the leak was at mile 0 on the platform, but the leak was really miles away, deep underwater. At 23:30, the seventh alarm. they finally decided to run a manual leak test comparing meter readings. The test confirmed a loss of 16 to 20 barrels per hour. Even then, they didn't shut down. After the test, they restarted the pump one last time until the eighth and final alarm sounded at 05:28. It had been over 13 hours since the first alarm. At dawn on October 2nd, a patrol vessel finally spotted the oil sheen, a 60-foot wide, 1.5-mile-long slick. An estimated 588 barrels of crude oil had leaked into the ocean. The cleanup costs would eventually exceed $160 million. In the final accounting, there was one piece of good news. Most importantly, there were no injuries. After the incident, the San Pedro Bay Pipeline was shut down. The damaged section was removed and replaced, and after extensive testing and new procedures were put in place, the pipeline was restarted on April 8, 2023. The investigation was definitive. The probable cause of the oil release was the proximity of the anchorages to the pipeline, leading to the anchor strikes during the January storm. But contributing to the disaster was the undetected damage and Beta Offshore's insufficient training of its pipeline controllers. It was a complete breakdown, from the design of the anchorage to the actions of the ship crews to the response of the pipeline operators. One of the main recommendations was to increase the margin of safety between anchorages and pipelines, for VTS to have audible and visual alarms for when a vessel encroaches on a pipeline, and for better training for pipeline controllers. The report is a lesson, a permanent reminder that in the maritime world, the most dangerous situation isn't a storm, it's a series of compounding mistakes, a chain of errors where one decision can prevent an accident. The story of the San Pedro oil spill is a chain of cascading failures. From my perspective as a deck officer, the most critical failure was the Marine Exchange of Southern California and the Coast Guard choosing to place anchorages alongside a pipeline. Additionally, the pipeline could have been buried, which would have prevented the accident. Given the proximity to anchorages, it was inevitable that the pipeline was going to be struck. But what do you think was the single most critical failure point? The anchorage design, the ship's crew, or the pipeline controllers? Share your analysis in the comments below. This channel is dedicated to analyzing these events through the eyes of a current mariner, and to ensure these lessons are learned and never forgotten.